Today on Exploring Scotland's History, we're going to discuss the land raiders and some of the riots that happened on the Outer Hebrides. Clearances had begun in the likes of Lewis from a way back in 1780. Cash-strapped landlords such as the Seaforth Mackenzies and the Mathesons had basically decided to thin out the population right from the butt of Lewis to the head of Barra. The crofters were squeezed really onto smaller pockets of land. They were trying to eke a living out of kelp. Unfortunately, the bottom fell out of that market in 1815, so really they were damned. In the 1820s, clearances began on the west coast, really clearing the land for large sheep farms like we have seen in so many of these clearance issues. The MacLeods used factors in the 1820s to clear the crofters from the land. The Earl of Dunmore, when he took over in 1830s, he did exactly the same thing. Dunmore, in order to facilitate his plan of eviction, did offer a lot of his tenants safe passage to Canada. He did also open up passage to Australia, and after the potato blight in the 1850s, in the wake of that, more and more people were taking him up on his offer. There were those that were left behind to try and manage the little pockets that they were living on. When you drive around Harris today and see how rough and barren the terrain is, it is hard to work out how you could have made a living out of a small pocket of land on it. Those that were left behind also struggled. They had to pay rack rent, which was really a payment in kind because the landlord gave them a pocket of land. They would have had road rent to pay as well. Part of the whole deal on the islands was to try and improve road and transport routes across the islands, so the islanders were paying for that. Doesn't sound that fair in my eyes. Over 100 years of sustained clearance would eventually take its toll. The islanders on Bernera had had enough. These people had been pushed and pushed on the smaller pockets of land and pushed off their land for a deer farm to take precedence. Matheson sent Monroe his factor in. His factor was known to be very heavy-handed. Monroe brought in a bailiff, and the bailiff was welcomed by people pelting him with sods of earth. The bailiffs did comment that had they been armed, they would have left mothers mourning sons. But that was the Bernera riot. People did not want to leave their land. As simple as that. They had farmed it for generations. 3 crofters were arrested, really to make an example of. Hundreds of crofters marched upon Lewes Castle and demanded that Matheson do something about the whole situation. Charles Innes, an Inverness lawyer, fought long and hard for the men and got them basically off. He is still revered on the island. Another riot disturbance worthy of mention is the Park riot. Again, crofters had been getting pushed off their land for a deer farm, and it was getting to the stage where they couldn't take any more. It's said they marched to the home of Mrs. Jessie Platt, who was the landlord of the area. She was also very well respected up until then. Their demands weren't met, however, and Mrs. Platt contacted the Secretary of State. He, in turn, sent the Royal Scots and a branch of Marines over to the island to quell the ones that were unruly. When the authorities did arrive, they commented that there were lots of dead deer about. Basically, people were so hungry that they had gone into the forest and culled the deer for their own consumption. These crofters were duly read the Riot Act and sent home. They had been out and camped in the forest and round the grounds of the estate for a couple of days, and they were quite happy to go home, all except Mr. McKinnon. Mr. McKinnon was spotted out and about with a gun and a deer over his shoulder. When the superintendent identified himself to McKinnon, he ran actually into Loch Seaforth and covered himself with seaweed. The powers that be thought that he had drowned until a couple of days later when he showed himself in Stornoway and gave himself up. It is said that he mentioned other raiders' names in order to get a full pardon himself. On the back of the park riot, there was the disturbance at Ignish. As you can imagine, blood was boiling and tempers were high after the first incident. The issue at Ignish, like so many other places, there was fantastic, decent land to be farmed. The landlord farmed it, and the crofters were left on small plots that were really quite barren and really not fruitful. The guys at Ignish tackled the landlord. Unfortunately, the authorities from the park riot were still on the island. They arrested 12 men and they were taken to task. The Riot Act was called in Gaelic, but nothing could take away the tension that these people were feeling. The Ignish monument sits about 100 metres from where the incident actually took place. The shape of the monument that I'll show here, it's built to show the anger and the anguish that the villagers were feeling at the time. But the land struggle would continue throughout the century and right into the 20th century and beyond the First World War. Enter Lord Leverhulme. He bought Lewis in 1918 and Harris the year after. He was an English industrialist. We probably know him best for Lever Brothers, soap manufacturing and things like that. As an industrialist, his vision of how he could make Harris and Lewis prosper was not really what the boys coming home from the war had in mind. Brave soldiers were coming back from the war. Some of them actually defined that their crofts had gone or been rapidly reduced, and they weren't happy about this. They had been promised that their lands would be there after the war, and now they came back and everything had changed. The soldiers demanded of Leverhulme that he basically put things back the way they were, to dismantle the large farms back into the smaller crofts that they had been used to previous to his buying the land. He did refuse, but eventually he reneged. Stornoway Town Council decided to do what the crofters really were a wee bit wary of doing due to the times and how poor they were. They bought the land. The Stornoway Trust was formed in 1923. It was made in trust by an Act of Parliament, and it was the first large estate that was fully community owned. Parts of Harris and Lewis that weren't taken into community trust were owned by companies such as Hugh Crofters, Park Crofters, Lewis Island Crofters. The names would imply that these also were community trusts. They weren't. There were tin pot companies that Leverhulme had basically enabled. He sold shares to them, and ultimately those parcels of land became deer hunting estates. All in all, the raiders took and reversed out of various parcels of land along the island right up until 1922, when the Board of Agriculture took control and turned these large farms back into the crofts that the people had been wanting from the beginning. There is one large lump of architecture that, in my eyes, is Leverhulme. We're currently driving to the bridge to nowhere along the road from hell. It's really high up and there aren't any crash barriers, so Martin, he can take over. The Bridge of Nowhere was a Leverhulme plan that did not come to fruition. His idea was to join up Ness and Tulsta. There was a fascination for some reason on the islands that we have to improve the roads and we have to have a proper road network. I expect a lot of these industrial guys from England were so used to many roads that they really couldn't understand the barren terrain of where they had landed. He did employ 150 people on the build of this bridge to nowhere. He was paying them 10 pence an hour, which apparently was really quite good at that stage, but it really couldn't take away from the fact that these guys wanted to be crofting. The road stops at the bridge, and beyond the bridge there is a mile of dirt track that just sort of peters out on barren moorland, and that's as far as his bridge got. In 1920, Leverhulme announced that he would not be investing anything else into the infrastructure of the island. On his death in 1925, his son pulled the plug on everything Harris and Lewis. Harris, that had been bought in 1919 for £36,000, was sold for a mere £900. The other parcels of land were sold piecemeal, and the only land that was truly safe was that owned by and controlled by the Stornoway Trust. The land raiders' monuments that pepper the islands now are a lasting reminder of the guys that fought to keep the crofting lands for crofting. They're beautiful to look at and to reflect on what life would have been like 100 years ago or more. Worth a visit to is the bridge to nowhere. It is a nice piece of architecture, despite the fact that it does literally go nowhere. It's beside Garry Beach, and there are beautiful sea stacks, and it is a stunning area. There's also a dun on top of one of the cliffs, so it's definitely worth a visit. But when Lord Leverhulme died, his dreams well and truly died with him. If you enjoy Scottish history and also stunning Scottish countryside, please subscribe. Hit the bell icon and you will be notified when we're out and about. Feel free also to join me on Facebook and Instagram, both of the same name, Exploring Scotland's History. Thank you for watching.